not able to be there, then they get the chance to see it. So I may be able to record it. Let me see, or whomever is hosting the meeting.
I've got it recorded.
Okay, good.
Okay.
So that's great. All right, so let me begin then. Let me start sharing my screen, and let's talk about pollination and pollination biology and all of the important roles that the insects and the animals are going to have with plants. And we're gonna begin with just a garden in Long Beach, more of what you may be seeing. And they're good, and they do their job. And as we are kind of moving forward, we're going to start to seeing people plant more plants or more designing gardens for pollination purposes, for assisting the animals. And so keep that in mind about designing a garden or inviting pollinators into your garden. So we need to have a few things. And for me to explain what is going to happen or what should happen, we need to step away from the urban gardens. We need to step away and go into the wilderness, because ultimately the insects that you want to attract are still out there. They're maybe in some protected area like Griffith Park, which is where I do a lot of my wildlife work. And so it is trying to get these animals some kind of habitat in and around the city so that they can have a place to be. So we need to go into Griffith Park, and we need to hike a little, but don't worry, we're hiking from your living room, so it's not going to be too strenuous. And we need to understand the relationship that the insects and or the animals and the plants have. And we're going to see many native plants and see the flowers and see how the plants and the insects have evolved together and how they have shaped each other's life. And so we're going to see a lot of beautiful flowers, because obviously pollination is going to entail flowers. The native ones are going to be out there. And whenever I'm mentioning pollination, or whenever somebody mentions a pollination garden, you need to think beyond the honeybee. And we know the honeybee is great. We know it provides honey, but the honeybee is European. The honeybee is a pet. The honeybee is a domesticated insect. So it can live very happily with rosemary, with lavender, because those would be the plants that the honeybee would be used to eating or has been eating off of for thousands of years. And so when we are looking at creating a pollination garden, it's going to be for feeding some of the beneficial insects that we know are going to be good for fighting the pest, and or some of the native insects that are also going to be good for the health and the well-being of the ecological system here. So yes, we love honeybees. Yes, they're pets. So think about them beyond. We need to look at other animals that you might not consider them as good or beneficial for pollination, but they are in fact good. So we need to start thinking about flies. Some of them are not going to be the garbage flies that you might be familiar with. They're going to be pollinating fly. We need to start thinking about different types of beetles that are going to be out there, as well as different bugs and many of the native solitary bees that are still out there, that it is unfortunate, and we'll talk about this, that the honeybee is causing a problem to them. So let's think about the native insects that would have been here, or that you want to bring out from the wilderness into your wilderness garden here in Long Beach. Oh, and that's another honeybee. But not all relationships are going to be pollination. So as we start thinking about animals and insects, be aware that sometimes there will be a small sacrifice in your garden, and that would be some of the plants that are destined to be eaten by some of the insects. So we do have caterpillars that will become butterflies, and we have many examples of this. So tolerance. Tolerance to insects, tolerance to caterpillars. I know they're icky, I know they're gross. Many people may not like them, but if you want to have beautiful butterflies, you have to tolerate them. So putting a few plants for sacrificing them to the insects to be fed on, it's a good thing. And you should not be too angry with them because they're only doing their job. The animal needs to feed and the plant is providing that nourishment which they need. So when we are looking at insects, there's going to be a few important things that you need to understand. Uh, so the insect anatomy. So we're going to have an animal that is going to have three different segments. The first segment is going to be known as the head. Obviously, this is going to have the eyes, which in most cases will have a very nice set of eyes to be able to see the flowers or be able to see you as you're coming close and they'll fly away. So that is very important. The head will come equipped with a pair of antennae. So insects that we're the ones we're going to talk about will have a pair of antennae on the head. And then there's going to be the thorax. The thorax for insects will have 6 legs. As well as with certain insects, it can house a pair of wings. And the wings will become very important because that's how the animals are going to be able to move around from flower to flower and be able to bring about good pollination. So thorax, 6 legs, wings if applicable to the insect. And then we have the abdomen, which is going to have the reproductive system, the digestive system, and all the other important components to the health and well-being of animal. So this is going to be what is known as the true insect. And this is going to what we're going to be concentrating on. We're not going to talk about spiders. That would be an entire different group of insects or animals. Are they good? The answer is yes. Do they bring about pollination? Not necessarily. They are going to be more carnivorous. They're going to be great for your garden. You should never kill a spider that's in the garden. They have their own specific role, and that is to control some of the insects that are going to be there. So here's one that just happened to think that is hiding from me, but obviously I was able to catch it and take a good photograph of it. But spiders are not going to be part of this role. There's going to be some grasshoppers that are going to be feeding off of your plant. Is there a big worry? No. Most of them will just hide, eat, and go away because they don't want to be seen by birds or you, because obviously you may kill them. And there's going to be maybe some beetles or different types of beetles. This one being shown is a ground beetle, not necessarily a pollinating insect, but it is a good predator for snails and slugs. And so bringing some into your garden or inviting them would be a good thing if you happen to be dealing with snails and slug in your garden. And here's one that happens to kind of look and resembles rock because their main line of defense is going to be always to hide and be cryptic. And here we have obviously lady beetles, ladybugs. I would like to have a disclaimer that I'm going to show a couple of clips that are not edited, wildlife clips. And so here's some mating lady beetles that are obviously going to be important for controlling some of the pest problems that you may be having. Or plants may simply have a nice place for the insects to sleep. As in this case with this beetle, it just happened to be caught outside in the night and it just kind of grabbed onto the branch and started sleeping. And so in the morning, move on and continue on with its life. So yes, the plants will provide good homes for those insects. And having a lot of diverse plants, meaning that there's going to be homes for different insects around. So here's just some beetles, and an insect on a plant is not necessarily bad. And just I always get many calls like, there's this insect on the leaf of my plant. Well, is the insect just taking a nap, sleeping, resting, moving on? What is this doing? What are the activities that you think that it's going to be bad? And so just be aware, they are the habitat of the insects. So just insects on a plant sleeping, not a problem. We do have cicadas around here. They used to be very common, but not anymore. Only a few areas still have them. They will eat or feed on the roots of plants for most of their life. And then for one day or maybe two, they'll come out, they'll sing, and they'll die. And that is their entire life cycle. So most people have never come across them because they might not be out there when they're singing. Or there's also used to be a lot of ant lions. So this would be insects that create a trap for ants to kind of stumble in, and they'll catch them and eat them. Obviously not for pollination, but good for other controls. And so the other first word that you need to understand is the word pollination syndrome. And so pollination syndrome is going to describe the characteristics that a plant has adopted to either attract or exclude a specific type of pollinator. And so we can take here our Western thistle that is going to show us a few important things. First of all, the plant does not want an animal that is going to land. So it wants somebody who's going to be able to hover and kind of be able to take the nectar, because the nectar, as we may already know, is going to be the payment or the source of food for many of the insects. So they're going to be seeking out the nectar from the flowers. Also the color, the specific colors on plants are going to determine which pollinator they want to attract or exclude. And also the lack or the presence of any kind of fragrance. So with the Western thistle, we see some kind of reddish color. We do not see a landing platform. And if you get your nose to it, it's not going to smell. That is because this is going to be a bird plant or bird pollinating plant. So the syndrome is for bird pollination. And so here I was very lucky to have taken the photograph of this hummingbird while it's feeding on the plant. Now this is very specific and there's going to be a few examples of this. And we'll get to see the other methods of pollination. So here's the perfect example of the pollination syndrome for bird, or for birds, or for, in our case, it will be hummingbirds. But then let's take a different one, and this is going to be the California buckwheat. If you grow any natives, this is very common. When we look at the buckwheat, we're going to find that it's going to have a lot of very small blossoms, if we're to use the right word. And when we look at the different blossoms that together collectively, they're going to create a much showier display. We're going to find the different parts of a flower. Obviously, these are going to be important. We're going to have the stamens that are going to have the pollen that is going to be important for the insects to pick up. We're going to have the petals and the sepals that are going to be important for the show, or in this case, it's going to act as a very good landing platform. So these insects will need to land, walk around, and pick up the pollen as they are feeding on the nectar. And then the pollen eventually needs to reach what is known as the stigma, which is the female component of the plant. When the pollen reaches the stigma, that has achieved pollination, which is the first step. The second step would be fertilization, and then will be the production of the fruit, and then the seeds, and then life goes on. And so this is going to be the role of the insects to take the pollen from the stamens and move it to the stigma. How it comes about, the plant doesn't really care. And so here we have just an example of a beetle. A beetle that is going to be eating the pollen. And yes, not all the pollen is going to be used for pollination. Many of it will be sacrificed to the insects for their diet. But in the process of the insects going from flower to flower, it will bring about pollination, or is hoping the plant will bring about The plant is hoping that it's going to bring in about pollination. But let's take a second. So I mentioned some videos, and this is another beetle. And let's watch it, and then we'll evaluate it. And so we saw a nice beetle. Here's some photographs from different angles. So one of the things that we can see here is going to be a lot of hairs on this beetle, and that is going to be important because it is through these hairs where the pollen is going to stick to the animal. And so a lot of the insects that you see that play a vital role in pollination will have a hair or some kind of hair. And perhaps the plant has selected the animals for having a lot of hair because they're much, much better. And so be aware of that as you're looking at other insects that are going to be shown later on. And so here is more a close-up of that beetle with the different hair, and there's a different view. The other thing that is going to be very important as we look at pollination is going to be the insect's mouth. Obviously, if they are made to have a liquid diet, they're going to have a proboscis like a butterfly. But the mouth also plays a vital role in determining what the diet is, or if they're good guys or bad guys, and how the plant and the insect have change each other. So here we have the insect, and if you notice, there is pollen grains attached to the insect. So that's what the plant wants. And so here's a different beetle. This one is a flower tumbling beetle. And so let's watch it. So what you should have noticed with that image or that video is how quickly the insects move. Because these are wild animals. They're going to be very skittish. It's not going to be like the honeybee that you can pet it. You can, it's going to work around you. It doesn't really care. These insects are still wild. They're frightened. And so if you have not seen them in your garden, it's because they see you a mile away and they hide or they go away, but they can be in your garden already. But be aware of this because they're just going to be visiting the flower for a very short period of time, long enough just to pick up the nectar and kind of move out of the way because there's going to be other predators. And so here we have the flower tumbling beetle that is going to be feeding on the nectar. And what we have here with the buckwheat is going to be something that we can refer to as a generalistic pollination, where any insect who wants a meal is welcome to come here. There's no specific insect that it wants. The more insects that they should visit the flower, the greater the chance that the plant will be successful with the pollination being achieved. And so here's just a flower tumbling beetle playing around in the different angles with the flowers. And even flies, I mentioned flies, there's going to be several groups of flies that are going to be specialized in pollination. So let's watch this. Let's watch the fly. So I mentioned the mouth being specialized. So here's the fly also with some hairs. And here's where it's probing. So it does have a long enough mouth that it's going to be able to reach. And so here's a couple more other flies or midge. So there's very tiny midge here. Let me play this again. So all those insects that are going to be pestering you, that you're going to be swatting them left and right, those are very good pollinators. And here's a very different beetle. Once again, lots of hair. And so with the photograph that we have here, you can see a lot of pollen all over the body. So no way can this insect miss coming in contact with the stigma and delivering the pollen. So we see a very different animal. And so we also have the toyon. The toyon, which is another very popular plant that also has a very big display of blossoms. And so we have some of the same beetles that will go and visit, this one being a longhorn beetle because it has very long antenna, or very long and we also have the flower tumbling beetle that is being seen here. Or we have phacelias or caterpillar phacelia here that will have some of the native bees. So the native bees that are going to be either solitary or they will have a village or a small group as opposed to the honeybee that has a very large hive. So these are going to be either by themselves or with a very small group of other bees that are going to also go about, find the pollen, find the nectar, and raise their young and make a life for themselves. So here is a nice native bee on the Phacelia, and here's some kind of small wasp. And you can see with its mandible, it's taking the pollen from those stamens right there. And here's a fly as well. So once again, you can see a very long mouth of the fly to be able to reach the nectar that may be hidden below or in some of the flowers that have developed some kind of floral tube. So here's a fly doing its job. And even the woolly star here will be visited by several bees. And you can see them here as they are picking up the pollen and moving around. And the fiesta flower, large display. Obviously, that's very important, having a lot of many flowers. And the smaller the flower, sometimes the smaller the pollinator. So this one being visited by a lot of very tiny beetles. And that's another thing, that most of the insects are going to be very small or too small. This is a regular photograph that I kind of can crop it and make it big to show some of the detail. But these are going to be very small if you were to see them out in the wild. And here's in the flower, and inside there is 2 or 3 more insects, or 4, maybe 5, and even probably more hiding underneath it. And sometimes they're going to meet with each other. So you have beetles, you have flies, you have bees, and obviously the strongest one is going to win. And this is where the honeybee may have a problem or may become a problem, because obviously it's going to be bigger, it's going to bully its way and kind of move the other ones and steal the nectar and the pollen from them. And then we have here a popcorn flower, and this is going to show us something different. We're going to have the flowers that are no longer going to be open to everybody. Now this is going to be specific pollination. The buckwheat was generalist, general, anybody is welcome. This one is only welcoming a few group of insects, the ones that will have the longer mouth part. Because as you can see with the flower, you don't see the reproductive structures. You don't see the stamens, you don't see the stigmas. And the nectar is hiding or hidden below the flower. And so it wants something to land, but it also, or not, but it's going to be looking for somebody special. And so let's look at that special insect that is going to be able to reach the nectar. And so we have a bee fly. So it's able to hover, but as you saw, it was briefly made a landing, very quickly drank the pollen and moved on. And when you see it, it is covered with hair. So it's going to be able to pick up the pollen. Uh, and so here's different views of it. And so here it is when it's on top of the flower. And here's a different view of it. And more important, here it is when it's probing the flowers. So it has its mouth part now inserted into the flowers and drinking the nectar. And here it is when it has brought this mouth part out. So you can see that the length of the mouth compared to its head is very, very long. And so it has no problem whatsoever in reaching some of the shallow nectaries that are made by the flower. So this would be specific for it. So the plant is taking a risk in just selecting one or two insects, because if something were to happen to those specific insects, then the plant is not going to have a pollinator. And so there's a risk, but it's also more of a guarantee because you're excluding everybody else, which means that only this insect is able to take the pollen and the nectar, and it's going to guarantee almost a pollination if the insect is around. And so this is where this fly has evolved over time a very long, narrow mouth part to be able to keep reaching the nectaries that may be getting deeper and deeper as the plants evolve and change. And so, but that will not exclude maybe some of the other animals like this native bee that is not able to get the nectar, but if the stamens are in close proximity, they can still take the pollen with them. Maybe they'll bring pollination, but their reward is not going to be pollen and nectar, it's just going to be pollen. And so we have here the next plant, which is the golden currant. And this one exhibits a very special syndrome, like we talked before. We have a flower tube that is going to be very narrow and very long. So whatever animal has to feed on the nectar that is below has to have a very long mouth. We have the stigma, and then we have the stamens that are just kind of on the outside here, just below, not very deep. And so we have also kind of yellowish, reddish color. So that is the specific syndrome. So let's watch whom the pollinator is going to be for this. So the beak of a hummingbird, not a problem. But there are many other insects that will visit this flower as well. So at the end of one of my hikes, I just kind of sat down, had my lunch, and started watching this very large plant full of flowers. And I was amazed of how many insects visited other than hummingbird. So yes, although the hummingbird may be the preferred pollinator, other insects may take the advantage of the pollen that is free, and they're just gonna have a meal, or again, they could also be as a maybe an emergency in case there's gonna be a low number of hummingbirds, the plant can still be brought the pollen. And so we have very large bees. We even have some butterflies that will visit this flower as well. And so let's watch the bees in action here. Once again, very quick. So that was all just a couple of seconds for it to take whatever it wants from the flower. So here's a different video. And then I lost it. The last one is going to be a very, very hefty bumblebee. And you can see that it's probably not the right pollinator because just how the flowers react to it. So watch, just the weight of the bee is just going to bring the flowers down. And then it's gone. And so where there's a will, there's a way. And so if it brings pollination, the plant doesn't care if it comes from the bee, if it comes from the hummingbird or any of the other insects. But then what happens? So the bee goes to the flower, pick up the pollen and the nectar. Then what? So now that has to go to the home of the insect. And so here we have some sand wasps. And so we know that the honeybees have their hive, that is their home. But the home for the other insects is just as important. And so having an area that is just going to be sand, no plants whatsoever, is also very important. Having dead wood material, fallen trees, branches where carpenters' bees can make their home is also very important. Not just let's put some flowers here for them to eat. Where are they going to live? Where are they going to raise their young? And so here you can see the abdomen of some of those bees as they are coming out from holes that they dug up in some sandy decomposed granite. So this is their home. And you can see the different holes that you see here, we have in this image. Those belong to each specific insect or a different insect. So having a home is very important. But that is only half the job. So let's take the example of what is known as the leaf cutter ant. Now, many people hate them because if you grow any kind of roses, you're gonna find very beautiful round cuts on your leaves. Those are done by the leaf cutter bee. So what happens? The bee is going to have to generate a nursery for their young. So they're gonna go to different plants, and roses would be one of them, and they are going to cut the leaves, and they are going to line the different nurseries, the different holes, wherever they happen to live. And so this is happened to be some that I found. And so here is what it would look like. So the bee has to create individual cells for each of their offsprings. And so many leaves will entail being cut to be able to achieve this. So here is that nursery. So it's going to have a lid because The bee is going to line the hole or the area, and then is going to put in the pollen. Once it puts in the pollen, then it's going to lay one egg that will become its offspring, and then it's going to protect it by putting a lid, and then the baby wasp bee is then going to carry out its life. And when we remove those lids, it's going to have several of them right here. And here is the inside, which you see a lot of pollen and one single bee feeding off of it. Now, let me bring this into human perceptions. Many of you are parents. Just take one of your first offspring. Uh, Before you had that child, you had to build a house. And then you had to provide food for that child. Just imagine gathering enough food for that child for its in 18th year, and that's going to be when they're an adult. So you would have to have all the food stored in that house from when they are born. You're going to place them there, and they're going to have everything, all the food that they need until they reach 18. That is a lot of work, and that is a big investment on each of the parents. And so every single native bee has to go out there and pick enough pollen for their offspring. And this is where the honeybee becomes a problem, because yes, the honeybees are going to be very, very good at gathering pollen, which is going to take it away from some of the native bees. But not by not having enough pollen, obviously, they're not going to be able to have enough or a lot of offsprings, and that's going to bring up down their population. And so this is what it happens. And so that is a lot of pollen. That is a lot of work. And yes, I know your children were also a big investment that took a lot of your resources. It is exactly the same component. Obviously, in a bee, it's going to be a lot smaller. In a human, it's going to be something much, much more massive. And so having a place for those bees to be able to make a home, store the pollen, lay the egg, raise their young is going to be also very, very important. And so if we now continue on with a different plant, here is the climbing pestiment. And I mentioned before, where there's a wheel, there's a way. Because the climbing pestiment is going to be a plant that exhibits the syndrome for a bird. A hummingbird will be its natural normal pollinator. But we see here in this image a bee that is going to be, okay, maybe taking some nectar from the flower. And then we see this very large bumblebee that is approaching the flower. Obviously, the bumblebee is not going to have a mouth that is going to be long enough to reach the nectar that is going to be found on the back of the flower tube. But where there's a wheel, there's a way, because when we look at this image, we see that the bumblebee is not following the right protocol, is not visiting the flower from the entrance. It's going straight to the back of the flower. And so this bee is plundering the nectar. So it goes to the back of the flower, and it creates or bites off the floral tube, and it creates a hole where it is now able to take the nectar from the flower. And once the nectar is gone, then there's no need for the hummingbird to visit, so that flower will not get pollinated, and there's not going to be fruits and no seeds. So yes, they could have a negative impact on the life cycle of this plant, not the life cycle, the reproduction of this plant. Uh, but wherever there's a wheel, there's always going to be somebody who's going to try to cut corners, and that would be the case here. And here is the image of that bee with when it's drinking the nectar from that flower, and it should be visiting from here, but it's not. And then we have the California wild rose, very generalistic and open, lots of stamens. Here being visited by many, many tiny beetles, and even some very large beetles that in the process, they may also munch on the petals. But if it brings about pollination, and as long as the center is okay, the rest of the flower is not that important. And then different types of clarkias or farewell to spring, as they are referred to, will be visited by an assortment of different insects. So here we have different beetles, tiny beetles, and here's another native bee that is also going to be visiting as well. And here's a close-up of that. And once again, notice all the hairs all over the body of that insect. And notice this one here with all of the hairs for kind of grabbing the pollen or trapping the pollen. So here's the bee. The fleabane aster has many of the sunflowers, very minute flowers or blossoms. So here's very tiny beetles just kind of probing their way in to take the nectar from below. Or the chaparral mallow, kind of hibiscus relative, here with a lot of stamens and a lot of yellow pollen. And here's a bee that is completely golden yellow with all the pollen that it has managed to grab and kind of almost bathe itself in pollen. And obviously it cannot avoid bringing pollination. And so some of the native bees, as well as weevils, which is another type of beetle right here. You can see this weevil walking around pollen and even covered with some pollen grains as well. So beetles and weevils. And the blazing star here, very generalistic, open to anybody, but anybody is going to be a very hefty and a big bumblebee. Here, probably one of the biggest ones that I have seen. And notice as bees have evolved with flowers, their rear leg has also become specialized with long hairs to become a basket. So that is the bee basket or the pollen basket, and that is where the insects are going to pick up the pollen, pack it in their rear legs, and that's how they're going to transport it to wherever they need to store it. So they have a specialized area on the rear legs known as the pollen basket. The fiddleneck here just being visited by a couple of tiny bugs, probably not the pollinator, but it's still some interaction there. The Nevis brickleberry here, very small, very minute flowers, and we happen to find a butterfly that is going to be visiting this flower as well. The telegraph plant here, also sunflower-like, different beetles, different bees. Beetle on the left, completely covered with pollen. Beetle was, while it's walking, also completely covered with pollen. And the golden yarrow here, by some kind of midge here feeding on the flowers, and also a native bee walking around. And even the flower tumbling beetle is not going to say no to the flower. The California lilacs or the ceanothus, very fragrant. Here being visited by the flower tumbling beetle as it's drinking the nectar. Here's a different beetle also drinking the nectar right there. Or the whitethorn, chaparral whitethorn, here being visited by very tiny bees, native bee right here and a little bit bigger right there. And here's a different view of the native bee. The cliff aster, almost anything. So here, let's watch this beetle. So I hope you notice the mouth. So what we see here is the front of that insect, but the mouth is going to be folded. So here's the mouth right there. That is the tip. And so the mouth is right here. So this is going to be a beetle specializing for reaching some of those deeper, narrow blossoms. And so here's the mouth when it's extended. So there is the tip. So that is going to be probed into those tiny blossoms for this aster. and take the nectar, and you can also see pollen all over the head and the body. So as it's tumbling, walking around, it's going to be bringing pollination, and there's a different view of the mouth part. So specifically designed for feeding on flowers or the nectar of flowers. Here's another beetle. Let's watch this one. So you notice this one had to force its way because it does not have that specialized mouth part. So it has to force its way. So this one has mandibles, good enough for taking the pollen from the stamens that were over here. But if it wanted the nectar, it had to kind of dig its way in to be able to reach it. And so that's what we saw in that video. And there's another beetle waiting for its turn later on. And so here's a fly. So we did not see it going to the flower, but we saw something that is also very, very important. Towards the end, we saw the fly grooming itself. Grooming is very important, obviously, but that is not something that the plant really wants. Because if this fly were to visit the flower and immediately grooms itself, knocking all the pollen off of its body, then that defeats the purpose of the flower and pollination. So in reality, the flowers or the plants want insects that are not going to be too picky about looking nice, or maybe a little bit dirty with pollen. That's okay. Keep as much of it. And so there has been some selection, I'm sure, for insects that are going to be less concerned with grooming themselves, so that they'll visit the flowers throughout the day. And maybe when they get home, they can then groom themselves, take the pollen off, and then begin with a new day the follow after night. And so that's going to be very important. We don't want insects to clean themselves right after visiting the flowers. It's not good. So here's two more beetles. I will caution you because once again, this is unedited. Obviously, Beetle decided that it was an opportunity for mating, and so it was encounter a female in while feeding, and so it took that opportunity. And so that's another very important job of the flowers. So there's going to be an attractive of different insects, and so many of them of the same species, and so there might be a, I want to say a party, but that could also happen. And so that's what we saw with these beetles. And so we have the same thing here. We have a lot of insects that congregate in large numbers because they take that opportunity to also find a mate, and there's already food. And so then the female is able and ready now to go and raise their young. So that's going to be right here. And so here's just different beetles just coming out of that flower right there. And so this a metallic wood boring beetle feeding on those on the flower here. And even just serving as a bed. So these two beetles just happen to spend the night. Just gonna curl the petals, go to sleep, and wake up the next morning when it's nice and warm, and go on with their daily activities. And so they're asleep there. And then here we have a fly or one of those midge. And so once again, look at the size of the mouth. It starts here and it goes way into those blossoms. So compared to the head or even the body, the mouth is very, very long. So another very specialized insect for pollination. And there's a side view as it's probing into the blossoms. And there as it's kind of retracting it. And then we have the sacred datura that is going to be pollinated usually in they say moths, but in the process, it's just a lot of stamens, a lot of pollen. So many bees will be taking the opportunity to take the pollen and hopefully bring about pollination, uh, as we can see right here. But it's also going to serve as a food source for different leaf beetles. So are the leaf beetles going to also bring about pollination? Perhaps, maybe as the adult feed on the pollen and the nectar, the young can feed on the leaves. So here are some of the youngs as they are feeding on the flowers and feeding on the leaves of the plant, and that would be the adult for this individual. And so eating or having a couple of bugs feed on your plant is not going to be detrimental. So here's just a shield bug that just happened to take in a stroll and feeding off of the plant, but not really bring about pollination, or a couple of other bugs. And even a weevil here kind of disguised. And then we have a few other insects that are going to feed on the leaf. Maybe as an adult, they will bring about pollination, but as a youngster, they're going to hide themselves very well. So they're going to create a cotton house. And when I took away that house, here is kind of the caterpillar or the larva stage, also blending in, blending very well with the stem. And even as it pupates, here is the cocoon right here. So this little ball that is blending in with the rest of the plant, that is where the insect is now carrying out its life cycle, and it's going to emerge as an adult. So the plants also kind of helped them in hiding from their predators. Because predators are going to be out there. I mentioned spiders are good, bad, your choice. They're good, guys. So here, spiders learn that if they hang around flowers, insects will come soon enough, and that's an opportunity for them to hatch a meal. And so that is a spider, garden spider that got one of the flies. And here's just another bug walking around. Some of the beetles just probably taking a break. Flower tumbling beetle, and even the monkey flower here being eaten by a caterpillar. Obviously, they're not going to eat every single flower. Maybe one or two will be sacrificed, but that's okay for the plant. And just some bugs walking around, feeding on the plant. The South Coast Morning Glory here in full flower, and this is probably one of the best examples. So we can see uh, a bee. Then I moved the flower and it became a concern. So perfect example, it kind of walked on the stamen and kind of fell into the stigma. That's what the plant wants. And so that is perfect pollinator for this individual. And there is a different one as is going out. But here's another different bee going in and one of them coming out. And it's a different bee as well. And another one. And let's watch this one. and it's gone. But you saw it using their rear leg to kind of scrape the pollen from its abdomen and kind of put it into the basket. And this is where we have a beetle party. So this is where you have dozens of beetles that congregated on a flower. And yes, there's mating going on. Yes, there's food. I'm sure there's drinking. And there's a bunch of other things that are no longer allowed right now. Not respecting that social distancing thing. But that's going to happen because the flowers are also going to act as a way of attracting or not attracting, but catching the sun rays and making the area a lot warmer. So even if this was a cool day or morning around the flower, it'll be a little bit hotter and they'll be able to move better and be more active. And so here is just a lot of very tiny beetles. And here just drinking the nectar, eating the pollen and just moving around. And here's a fly that is also doing its pollination. So on the stigma right now. And probably the bigger or the better pollinator would be this very large hover fly. So when we see a close-up, we see that it's much, much bigger. And in just trying to go into the nectar, it will definitely come in contact with the reproductive structure. And the pollen will be placed on the back. As we can see here, the stamen kind of rubbing the pollen on the back of that insect and being held, the pollen being held by the hairs. So that would be probably the prime pollinator for this morning glory right here, this very large fly. The wild cucumber pollinated by insects, but it was also the site for this leaf-footed bugs to carry out its mating rituals. So here they are feeding on the fruit, but also mating as well. So that's also important for their life cycle and their population. Some of the cacti, obviously they're not going to be too picky. They're going to be open pollination. And so here we have a lot of stamens. Here we have a lot of very small native insects. And then we have a bee comparing in size right here. And so as mentioned before, the bee will have no problem pushing all the others away and taking the pollen and nectar for themselves. And that's going to be a small problem. We have some of the bulbs, such as the wild hyacinth here, that when they're in bloom, they are going to be very good and important. So here, let's watch a bee. And so you can see here the pollen basket. The pollen basket in on this bee that has worked the entire morning to probably can't get that amount of pollen. So it will take many, many flowers to provide that amount of pollen. And so that's why it's important for having a lot of different plants and different flowers so they can have a source of pollen. And so here is a different bee right here. You can see it. And also its pollen basket loaded with the pollen and or just serving as a area to spend the night. So here's another bee that it's solitary. So wherever the night happens to catch it, it's just going to find a flower, take shelter, and sleep. And next morning, it's going to carry out its daily chores. And so habitat, house, very, very important as well. And this one in the company of a couple of other beetles. Even the hoverfly right here, taking the nectar and the pollen, and even very tiny beetles right here, feeding or taking the pollen and the nectar from the flowers, and even a lady beetle, sure, not pollination, but eating the bugs that may be feeding on this plant, and also thrips. We know that in gardening, we consider thrips as something negative, but no, thrips are going to be very, very good. Most of the very tiny, tiny flowers in the sunflower family, like the asters, are going to be pollinated by thrips because they're going to be very small, minute insects, and they'll be able to go inside into the flowers. And the other thing that is very important for you to understand regarding hummingbirds. Yes, the hummingbirds will drink the nectar as a source of carbohydrates, but the animal also needs protein. So the hummingbirds are also looking for the insects that are going to be inside the flowers. And so in the process of them taking the nectar, they'll catch whatever insect is also in there and they'll eat it mixed with the nectar. And so the protein for the hummingbirds via the insect is going to be very important for the diet of the hummingbird. And that will come from very small insects that are going to be very small to see with the naked eye unless you have a sharp eye vision or vision. But that will be the case of the thrips that will be providing that to the hummingbirds. And then butterflies. We do have a slew of different butterflies that will be out there that can visit the flowers. Here's the gold star with the yellow flowers and a lot of native beetles and bees. We have the different mariposa lilies here, the Catalina mariposa lily, being visited by none other than a very large bumblebee, obviously big flowers being big insects. And here's another very large bumblebee coming out of it. The plumber mariposa lily, here being visited by side view by some beetles and bees. So here's the beetle that happens to be visiting it. And there's another very large hefty bee coming out. The yellow mariposa lily here being visited by some moths. And again, we think about the large, beautiful, colorful butterflies, but moth, which will do a lot of their work at night, will also have a very important role in the pollination of plants. So another drab, they're not as pretty, colorful, but here is a moth that came out of the flower. And then we have obviously the best example for plant animal interaction, and that's going to be the milkweed. We know the milkweed is vital for the monarch butterfly, but it's also vital for other insects, and including some of the butterflies, because it will have nectar. Nectar that we can see here, flowers being visited by very tiny beetles all over each of those blossoms, and sacrificing the leaves and the plants for the caterpillars of the monarch butterflies to continue on the life cycle. And here's a very tiny native bee stepping on the flowers, and another native bee, or the same one, just kind of moving around, picking up the pollen and the nectar. And skipper butterflies here, beautiful proboscis, very long, able to probe into the very narrow floral tubes created by those little aster plants. So that's a skipper. And here's a different skipper on a different plant, also very, very narrow. So the proboscis plays a major role for butterflies. And so butterflies are also going to be important. And our last example here is going to be what we like to refer as a very, very specific pollination. We saw generalistic, and we saw just a specific one, but this is going to be a one-to-one. A very specific pollinator that will be pollinating what we like to refer to as the chaparral yucca, our Lord's candle. It goes by many different names. And so we're going to study this one in detail because it's amazing what's going to happen. So the flower is going to grow for many years, and then it's going to set a bunch of flowers. And so we have the flowers here on display. And the flowers are going to want a specific pollinator. So here is the flowers. Same thing we've seen. We have the stamens right here with the pollen, and then we have the ovary with the stigma right there. And so we can see being visited by a lot of different midge, but the midge are not going to be the rightful pollinator for this specific plant. We can see some flies here, just kind of either taking a nap or eating the pollen and the nectar, but those flies are not that specific pollinator that we want. Here's a moth, and here's the stamens for you to see and the stigma. And so here's the moth. We are looking for a moth, but not this one. The moth that we're looking is in the image that is being displayed right now. If you don't see it, it is because it's cryptic, but it's right here. And so what we need to look for is known as the yucca moth. And it is known as a yucca moth because it is the sole pollinator for this specific plant. So here are two of them. Now, is it coincidence that the moths are hanging around the immature ovary of the plant? And the answer is no. So here is the moth, and here's the ovary of the plant. So here is where the plant and the insects have reached a very intricate relationship. So what we're seeing right now is the moth is going to lay its eggs inside the different ovules or the immature seeds of the flower. And so right now it's laying its egg. It's going to use a special egg laying apparatus from the abdomen. It's going to literally stab the ovary of the flower, and it's going to lay the eggs inside the ovary. What will follow then is that the moth will deliberately pollinate the flower. Prior to this, we've seen pollination kind of as a mistake, kind of as a stumbling, an accident. This is deliberate because the young or the babies from this moth is going to rely on the developing seeds as a nourishment. So this is the case where the plant ensures a pollination by this moth, but the plant is going to be sacrificing certain amount of seeds, not all of them, certain numbers to the moth. But it's going to ensure pollination, and the moth can only lay their eggs and have their youngs develop inside a yucca plant. So it must find a yucca plant during the right stage. And so here is the moth laying the eggs. And here's a different view of that moth. The moth has also evolved with the flowers and the plants because in its thorax, it's going to have a special basket for the pollen. So it's not going to be like the bees where it's on their legs. It's a special pollen basket on their thorax where they will carry the pollen from flower to flower. So they'll go pick it up, store it, lay the eggs, pollinate it, and then move on to the next flowers. So when we see what happened here, the moth stabbed the ovary, laid the eggs, and the ovary is still immature. But when we fast forward time and the ovary begins to develop, we can see the wound or the damage that was done by the stabbing. So you can see here a depression. As the ovary becomes wider, bigger, obviously the damage is going to be much, much more noticeable. It started as a maybe tiny thing, but then it became bigger. And you can see the damage on the ovaries or on the fruit behind it, and even over here. And as we keep forward in time and see a mature ovary here, we can still see the damage here on a mature fruit. So we see this depression and this damage. That is where the moth has injured the fruit during the flower stage. Now, when the seeds mature, they're going to be released, and then those will be then becoming new plants. However, the sacrifices from the plant are going to remain behind. And so when we go back and see something that looks like seeds here, several of them, they're no longer viable. Instead, what we have is the area where the baby moth lived its entire juvenile stage. And when it became an adult, it kind of chewed a hole, and it kind of just went away. And we can count the number of seeds. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, maybe 15 seeds that the plant has sacrificed for one moth. But many more went on and became new plants or got distributed. And so when you kind of break that apart, you can see inside, it's kind of like a compartment in a very tiny apartment that this moth was eating as it kept growing and then eventually became an adult. And so we have, for many, many years, this association, and it's still going on. And this is once again where the honeybee can become a problem. Because if the honeybee, which is very good at picking up pollen, goes before the moth and picks up all the pollen from the yuccas, then the yucca moth is not going to be able to grab pollen, and it's not going to complete the pollination cycle that it must. And so that can definitely hinder the seed production of the yuccas. And that has continued on, and it will continue on. So this is definitely a one-to-one association. You have one specific plant that is dependent on one specific insect, and the relationship is very, very, very old. And so with this slide, I think I will end it, and I will stop sharing my screen and answer any question that you might have. Any questions?
You have to unmute, don't forget.
Yes. I hope you recorded it. Share it with your members.
Yeah. That was great.
I read in the paper monarchs are in danger. Is that right?
Yes. So one of the things that we have to first clear is the concept of weed. Not as in marijuana, that's a different one. But milkweed got its name because it started appearing in farms and agriculture areas, because that's where they decided to build the farms. And so that kind of has a negative connotation.
Right.
But yes, because there are very little milkweeds, or at least wild milkweeds, that will be able to sustain a very large diversity of the monarchs. Yes, it's a problem.
I thought it was needle milkweed that the butterflies need, not the other one that you just mentioned.
So you have different milkweeds from Northern California and Oregon all the way to South America, because you have monarchs in all the different parts of America, even in Europe. If you're looking at Southern California, there are 3 main milkweeds. One is the longleaf milkweed, and I can use hoity-toity names. There's the hairy leaf milkweed, and there's also, as you venture into the desert, there's the desert milkweed. However, there are now milkweeds that are available from many sources that have come from different areas. Ideally, if you want to do the right thing, it would be to plant some of the native milkweed that would normally be found here. That would be ideal.
But
at the end
what's the name of those? What's the name of those?
It's the narrow leaf milkweed.
Narrow leaf, yeah, that's the one I thought. Yeah. Narrow leaf.
But in the absence of that, any of the other milkweed will also work. So again, there's the preference, the preferred one, but is it hindering the monarchs if you have some of the other ones that is going to be easier to get? The answer is no. At the end of the day, they're still helping the population.
Okay, thank you.
We want to move on to other questions.
I think Jay.
Go ahead.
Okay. I have a couple. So where did you find those little leaf incubating things for
The gallery for the...
Yes, with the rose leaf?
It was on a 1-gallon container plant here in Long Beach in the garden. I think I picked it up and they came out of the drainage hole at the bottom.
So would we ever see that? Or I guess we just have to look for those round things. That seemed like a miracle to me.
I was very happy, yes. So one of the things that you may see in your garden center or that they recommend is that you build a bee house with bamboo, because the bamboo have or straws. There's many things, because that's kind of like the right diameter for them to do that. I was very lucky. I think I just got very lucky, because if I look to, most of them are going to be either hidden or well hidden, or it's not going to be normally not in a pot, but it's just happened to be there. So that's it. I'm lucky. Sorry.
Yeah. Wow. That would have been just so exciting. Anyone else have a question? I have a question. Where's my other question?
Jean has a question.
So are non-native bees, well, first of all, are non-native plants bad? I have a lot of them from Australia and Africa.
The answer is no. Because when we started clearing the native habitat, the native vegetation, and we started planting the non-native, if that was all that it was available for the insects to feed on, they did. And so that's why we have some insects still lingering on. So are they good and bad? Are they bad? No. Can we benefit by incorporating other natives to bring about diversity? The answer is yes. And I think that's the main key here. You have to have more diverse. When you have just an acre of rosemary, okay, that's good for a certain number of insects. But when you have more diversity, when you have different types of nectar that is going to have different vitamins and minerals, different types of pollen, different types of hiding areas, that's what we're trying to mimic, more of the wildlife, which is not going to be as pretty, not as ornamental, but it's taking the concept of having a human ornamental garden to more of a wildlife habitat garden, which is going to be two very different things. And I think we need to accept the other one and be able to tolerate leaves on the ground, because those are going to be hiding places for insects. Branches that are dead on a plant, that's good for insects. Not everything nice and prune and preen, because that's going to be eventually good for insects and wildlife. So they're not bad. I'm not going to say stop planting them and go native. I'm never going to say go native and don't plant natives. I think bringing the two together would be a more of a diverse garden, and that's going to be the key.
Thank you, Jean. Jane?
I'm just astounded. I just wanted to share with everyone, because I was counting. I think you mentioned at least 25 plants and probably about 20 insects. And the part about the plants, I'm wondering, I know that a lot of them grow in the wild, and I know that I've not seen any of these names at Tree of Life or Theodore Payne, but is there a way of sourcing the seeds or the bulbs?
So, so the common ones are available. The perennial ones are available. The seeds, you can also find them through Tree of Life. You can definitely ask for them. They should have them. If not, you can request for them. But the bulbs, The bulbs will be something much more difficult. So sometimes every once in a while Trio Life will have them, but because they're not as common, members will usually grab them first. The Mariposa lilies have now been domesticated and even hybridized in Holland. So you can actually buy them where you buy the tulips from Holland. You can sometimes find the Mariposa lilies.
Great.
And that's already done. Some of the others, I think as you take advantage of some of these plant sales when they come back or some of these areas. And I think if they know that people are interested, they're going to grow them. Right now they're growing probably the same thing because that's what they're advertising. Here, grow this, works well. But if somebody's ready, is like, I'm ready to take the next step and I would like to now try this one, I think they are also ready to bring about more plants into the industry and just have them available.
I want a popcorn plant, a popcorn flower.
Those are not native.